Imagine waking up one morning with a quiet but unsettling realization. Not that something terrible has happened, Sunny, but that something terrible has always been happening. And you were taught to call it normal. Consider this carefully. What if most people are not trapped by violence, force, or visible oppression, but by systems they willingly participate in, defend, and financially support? What if the modern human condition is not one of freedom constrained, but of obedience disguised as choice? This is not a conspiracy theory. It is far more uncomfortable than that. It is an agreement, an unspoken contract between the individual and the system, where comfort is exchanged for consciousness and survival is mistaken for freedom. Throughout history, thinkers have warned us that the most effective prisons are not built with walls, they are built with beliefs. Plato described a cave where prisoners mistake shadows for reality. Aldous Huxley warned that future control would not rely on pain but on pleasure, distraction, and voluntary compliance. Michel Foucault observed that modern power no longer needs chains because people learn to discipline themselves. Yet, despite these warnings, humanity did not rebel. Instead, it optimized the cage. Now ask yourself something. Honestly, if most people are free, why are so many exhausted? Why do so many feel permanently behind, chronically anxious, and quietly dissatisfied, even when they are doing everything they were told was right? That question is the doorway. Because if freedom were real in its fullest sense, it would not feel this fragile. The first mechanism of modern control is subtle, the illusion of choice. We are told we are free because we can choose what to buy, what to watch, what to study, and who to become. But look closer. The paths are pre-built. The destinations are predefined. The rewards are conditional. From early childhood, most people are placed on a narrow track: education, productivity, income, consumption, retirement. The system does not ask, "Who are you?" It asks, "What can you become useful for?" School rewards compliance more than curiosity. Jobs reward output more than insight. Society praises obedience as responsibility. And so, people learn quickly, not how to think, but how to fit. They learn when to speak, when to stay silent, and which questions are acceptable. Over time, something profound happens. The external rules become internal habits. People stop needing supervision because they supervise themselves. They compare themselves constantly. They fear falling behind. They fear being different. Not because someone threatens them, but because exclusion feels worse than confinement. And here is the hidden cost. People pay for this system, not just with money, but with time, attention, health, and creative energy. Think about how much of your life is spent maintaining stability rather than exploring possibility. How much of your week belongs to obligations you did not choose but inherited? The philosopher Erich Fromm observed that modern humans shifted from being to having. Identity became something to acquire rather than discover. Instead of asking what messes who am I, people ask, what do I own? What do I display? What do others think? Consumer culture does not simply sell products, it sells identities. You are taught to express yourself through brands, status symbols, and curated images. And the tragic brilliance of this system is that the void it creates is the same void it promises to fill. People consume to feel whole, but the hunger never ends, because the hunger was designed. A person defined externally is infinitely manageable. Fear of losing status keeps them compliant. Fear of judgment keeps them silent. Fear of instability keeps them working. Now pause for a moment. When was the last time you wanted something without being influenced by comparison, expectation, or pressure? How many of your desires were planted before you ever examined them? This is not about blame. It is about awareness. Because the most effective systems of control do not feel like oppression. They feel like normal life. They feel like responsibility. They feel like just how things are. And the moment you stop questioning, the system no longer needs to convince you. You convince yourself. In the next session, we will move deeper. We will examine how economic pressure, debt, and constant busyness keep people too occupied to ever ask the questions that matter. Because a mind with no time to reflect rarely wakes up. But before we go there, sit with this thought. If your life were truly your own, not shaped by silent expectations, inherited definitions, and invisible rules, how different would it look? That discomfort you feel right now? That is not fear, that is awareness knocking. And awareness is where freedom begins. If this session made you pause, reflect, or feel something deeper, support the quiet paradox by simply liking this video. If the first cage was built through conditioning and identity, the second cage is reinforced through exhaustion. Because a tired mind does not question, a stressed mind does not rebel, and a busy mind rarely reflects. Modern society tells people they are free, yet quietly organizes life so that most waking hours are spent maintaining survival, not exploring meaning. Think carefully about the structure of an average life. Wake up tired, rush through the morning, work most of the day, return home depleted. Distract yourself just enough to forget the discomfort. Sleep, repeat. Years pass. Dreams are postponed. Curiosity fades. Inner questions grow quieter. Not because people are incapable of depth, but because depth requires time and time has been monetized. The economic system is not merely a way of organizing resources, it is a way of organizing human attention. Most people are taught how to earn money, but never how money works. They are trained to be workers and consumers, not thinkers and designers of systems. As a result, the structure feels natural, unavoidable, permanent. But history tells us otherwise. Money, debt, interest, banks, and markets are not laws of nature. They are human constructs, yet today they are treated with more reverence than human well being. Debt, in particular, is one of the most powerful tools ever created. It does not need force, it creates obligation. Many people enter adulthood already owing years of future labor, student loans, mortgages, credit cards, car payments. The future is sold before it arrives. And once someone owes their future, their present is no longer free. They cannot easily walk away. They cannot risk uncertainty. They cannot pause and reevaluate because stopping feels dangerous. Debt does not just control finances, it controls choices, and the system normalizes this completely. Being in debt is called responsible, working endlessly is called ambition. Burnout is reframed as hustle culture. But ask yourself honestly, if a system requires most people to be permanently tired just to function, is it serving humanity or feeding on it? Michel Foucault once observed that modern power does not need to punish, it simply needs to shape behavior. People push themselves harder than any authority ever could. They fear falling behind. They fear becoming irrelevant. They fear instability. And so, they comply not because someone demands it, but because fear whispers that there is no alternative. But the consequences go deeper than finances. Time spent constantly working and worrying is time not spent reflecting. And reflection is dangerous to any system that depends on compliance. Ancient philosophers understood this clearly. Aristotle believed that freedom required leisure, not entertainment, but space for contemplation. Yet in the modern world, even rest has been colonized. Weekends are filled with errands. Free time is filled with screens. Silence is avoided. The moment stillness appears, discomfort follows. So distraction rushes in to save us. Endless scrolling, endless content, endless noise. The modern version of bread and circus fits in your pocket. Entertainment today is not designed to awaken, it is designed to occupy. Hours vanish without memory. Attention is fragmented. Thought becomes shallow. And while people argue online, compare lives, and chase fleeting stimulation, the deeper structures of their existence remain untouched. Carl Jung warned that humanity was not suffering from lack of information but from lack of meaning. Yet meaning requires presence, and presence is incompatible with constant urgency. A person who is always rushing rarely asks why they are running. A person who is always reacting rarely observes, and observation is the beginning of freedom. Here is the uncomfortable truth. A population that is exhausted is easy to manage. Exhausted people consume to cope. Exhausted people follow familiar paths. Exhausted people accept narratives without examining them. They mistake survival for success, and so the system continues. Not because it is perfect, but because it leaves little room to imagine alternatives. Now ask yourself something deeply personal. How much of your energy is spent merely maintaining your position rather than expanding your life? How many of your dreams have been postponed not because they were impossible, but because you were too tired? In the next session, we will move inward. Because the most powerful form of control does not operate through money or labor, but through beliefs. We will explore how identity, culture, and inherited narratives shape the inner world long before a person realizes they are being shaped. And why the most difficult prison to escape is the one that feels like who you are. But before we go there, remember this. A system that depends on your exhaustion cannot survive your awareness, and awareness begins the moment you slow down enough to see clearly. If this session resonates and you want to continue this journey with the quiet paradox, make sure to subscribe. If exhaustion controls the body, belief controls the mind. And the most powerful beliefs are the ones you never remember choosing. Long before you could think critically, long before you could question authority, your understanding of reality was already being shaped. You inherited ideas about success, failure, love, power, money, morality, identity, and purpose from family, culture, education, media, and tradition. They arrived quietly, repeated gently, reinforced constantly, and because they arrived early, they felt natural. This is the deepest layer of human control, not force, but familiarity. Most people do not realize that their worldview is largely borrowed. They mistake conditioning for personality, they mistake fear for realism, they mistake conformity for maturity. Jean Jacques Rousseau once wrote that humans are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. Those chains are not always visible, they are assumptions. A child begins life curious, expressive, imaginative, and open. But slowly, boundaries appear. Don't ask that. Be realistic. That's not how the world works. People like us don't do that. Over time, possibility shrinks. The child learns when to suppress instincts, when to doubt creativity, when to seek approval instead of truth. Eventually, control no longer needs to come from the outside. It lives inside the voice of the mind. This is why most adults follow unwritten rules without ever seeing them written. Rules about what is acceptable to want, rules about how far is too far, rules about what success should look like. Deviation becomes frightening, not that, not because it is dangerous, but because it threatens identity. Abraham Maslow observed that people often fear their own potential more than their limitations, because stepping into awareness means responsibility, and responsibility means you can no longer blame the script. Look at how society defines value. Worth is measured by productivity, status by achievement, identity by labels. Very little space is left for inner depth, wisdom, stillness, or self knowledge. And so people perform. They perform competence, they perform confidence, they perform success, while quietly feeling disconnected from themselves. Great thinkers warned us about this. Tolstoy wrote that people mistake the appearance of life for life itself. Henry David Thoreau warned that many live lives of quiet desperation. But these warnings are uncomfortable because they suggest that something is wrong not with the individual, but with the shared agreement we call normal. Another powerful layer of mental control is group identity. Humans seek belonging, Naikondokan, and systems exploit that need. Nationality, religion, ideology, profession, social class. These labels provide meaning, but they also outsource thinking. Once identity is tied to a group, questioning feels like betrayal. We believe this. We don't do that. People like us think this way. Independent thought becomes risky. George Orwell warned that the greatest threat to freedom was not oppression, but the loss of the ability to think independently. When emotion replaces reflection, people become predictable. They react instead of observe. They defend beliefs instead of examining them. And again, the cost is paid. Paid in inner conflict, paid in suppressed authenticity, paid in unrealized potential. People consume to reinforce identity. They argue to protect belonging. They follow narratives to avoid uncertainty. Now ask yourself something unsettling. If you had been born in a different culture, to different parents, in a different time, would you think the same thoughts you think now? If not, how many of your beliefs are truly yours? And if they are not yours, who are you beneath them? This question frightens most people because without borrowed identity, there is silence, and silence demands self confrontation. But here is the paradox: the mind that is most controlled is the one that believes it is completely free. In the next and final session, we will arrive at the deepest truth of all: why no external system is required once the unconscious mind takes control. And more importantly, what dissolves every chain at once. Because there is a way out. But it begins where most people never look: within. If this session moved something inside you, support the quiet paradox by leaving a comment with your thoughts. We have now reached the deepest layer. Not the system outside you, not the economy, not culture, identity, or tradition, but the place where all power ultimately resides: the unconscious mind. This is the final truth most people never face, Suklandyo, because once it is seen, nothing can ever be unseen. Humanity is not primarily enslaved by governments, corporations, or institutions. Those are only reflections. The real captivity happens when a person does not understand their own mind. Carl Jung expressed it with brutal clarity. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Read that slowly. Because hidden inside that sentence is the explanation for nearly every human struggle. When beliefs are unconscious, they feel like truth. When fears are unconscious, they feel like reality. When conditioning is unconscious, it feels like personality. And so most people live reactively. They respond instead of choose. They follow instead of observe. They repeat instead of create. A predictable mind is the easiest mind to control. If someone fears judgment, they will self censor. If someone fears instability, they will obey. If someone seeks validation, they will perform. And no authority needs to enforce this. The individual becomes their own guard. This is why external freedom has never been enough. History is filled with revolutions that replaced one system with another, while leaving the internal structure untouched. The chains changed shape, but not location. Plato warned that those who mistake illusion for reality will defend their chains. And that is the tragedy. People protect the very beliefs that limit them because those beliefs feel like who they are. The world does not need to silence awakened individuals. It only needs to keep most people distracted, fearful, and unconscious. Because an unconscious mind will always choose familiarity over freedom. Look closely at modern life. People exhaust themselves to prove worth, they consume to feel complete. They argue over symbols while ignoring substance. They chase permission to be themselves. And all of this feels normal. But normal does not mean natural. Jiddu Krishnamurti once said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." What if anxiety, burnout, emptiness, and restlessness are not personal failures, but symptoms of collective unconsciousness? What if humanity has adapted to confinement so thoroughly that it calls the cage reality? Now, here is the turning point. Systems of control only work when awareness is absent. The moment a person begins to observe their own mind, not judge it, not suppress it, but see it clearly, the structure begins to crack. When you notice that a belief is inherited, it loses authority. When you see fear as conditioning, it loosens its grip. When you recognize identity as constructed, you are no longer imprisoned by it. This is why self-knowledge has always been dangerous to systems of control. Socrates was executed not for rebellion, but for teaching people to examine themselves. Because a person who understands their own mind cannot be easily manipulated. They no longer seek validation externally. They no longer fear exclusion as deeply. They no longer confuse survival with meaning, or they become internally sovereign. And this changes everything. A conscious individual does not need to escape society. They transcend its illusions. They work, but are not defined by work. They consume, but are not consumed by desire. They participate, but do not surrender their inner authority. This is real freedom, not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of clarity, not rebellion against the world, but mastery of the self. And here is the final realization. Freedom is not something granted. It is something recognized. The prison dissolves the moment you realize you were never locked in, only asleep. Awakening does not require destruction of the system, it requires understanding how the system entered your mind. When that happens, fear loses leverage, distraction loses power, comparison loses meaning. And for the first time, a human being stops reacting to life and starts living it consciously. Now ask yourself, truly, what would change if you took responsibility for your inner world? If you questioned inherited beliefs, if you observed your fears instead of obeying them, if you defined success from the inside out, the world would not collapse. But your illusions might. And that is the beginning of liberation. Because the greatest form of enslavement was never external. And the only key that has ever existed was awareness. The journey does not begin out there. It begins the moment you look inward and refuse to look away. Now tell me in the comments, what part of this series challenged you the most? Let the quiet paradox know you were here.